Hello and welcome to our next continuing lecture in physiological psychology. We're continuing on from talking about circadian rhythms and our 24-hour cycle to talking about sleep specifically. So what we're going to talk about first is a basic introduction to sleep, talk about the various sleep stages, the brain mechanisms of sleep and waking, what's happening during rapid eye movement sleep, sleep disorders, functions of sleep, and a little bit about dreaming. Sleep is a state that the brain actively produces. It's characterized by a moderate decrease in brain activity and decreased response to stimuli. Sleep differs from the following states in a number of ways. First of all, coma is an extended period of unconsciousness characterized by very low brain activity that remains fairly steady. There aren't different stages of a coma like there are sleep. A persistent vegetative state, the person alternates between periods of sleep and moderate arousal, but with no awareness of their surroundings. A minimally conscious state is one stage higher than a vegetative state, marked by occasional brief periods of purposeful action and limited speech comprehension. So these are generally, of course, due to some sort of brain injury, sometimes lasting for days, weeks, and months, or even years. Brain death is finally the lowest of these activities, where there's no sign of brain activity and no response to any stimulus. There are different stages of sleep. Primarily, we use electroencephalography, allowed researchers to discover these various sleep stages. This allows researchers to compare brain activity at different times during sleep. But oftentimes we also use a polysomnograph, which is a combination of electroencephalography and eye movement records. And that becomes important because eye movements are such an important part of understanding the overall sleep process. In addition, oftentimes these will include other measures if we're interested in studying the full effects during the sleep cycles. For example, a penile plethysmograph might often be used on a male to determine when sexual arousal occurs during sleep, which often again occurs during rapid eye movement sleep. So this is essentially what this looks like. We have electrodes for measuring facial muscles, and eye movements, which are what these electrodes are here for, and then a few scalp electrodes. This is very different from a dense EEG array that we might use in an event-related potential study. So stage 1 sleep, this is when you first start to fall asleep. We have what are called alpha waves that are present when one begins a state of relaxation. Stage 1 sleep is when sleep has just begun. The EEG is dominated by irregular, jagged, and low voltage waves, and this is when brain activity begins to decline. Stage 2 sleep is characterized by the presence of sleep spindles. These are 12 to 14 hertz waves during a burst that lasts about a half a second, and also what are called K-complexes, which are sharp waves associated with temporary inhibition of neuronal firing. Slow wave sleep, which are stage 3 and stage 4, together constitute what we call this slow wave sleep. This is characterized by slow, large amplitude waves in the EEG, the slowing of your heart rate, breathing rate, and brain activity, and highly synchronized neural activity. This is the deepest form of sleep. This is when you're hardest to wake because you are in a very, very deep sleep. So you transition through these stages and back up and sort of up and through these stages throughout the night. We also have a period of sleep known as paradoxical sleep, or REM sleep. It's characterized by rapid eye movement sleep, which describes periods characterized by rapid eye movements during sleep. We call this paradoxical sleep because it's a deep sleep in some ways, but a light sleep in other ways. And also, your brain is much more active. So the EEG waves are irregular, low voltage, and fast. And your postural muscles of the body are more relaxed than in other stages. In fact, we're generally pretty paralyzed during sleep. In fact, some people suffer from what's called sleep paralysis, where they wake up conscious, but their muscles haven't, their muscular cortex, and the part of the brain associated with moving has not woken up yet, and so they're completely paralyzed, and it's really quite terrifying. So to give you an idea what these brain waves look like, here in the upper left-hand corner, we have what your general brain wave would look like during a relaxed awake state. Then we get into stage 1 sleep, lower voltage, but still fairly regular activity. So we start moving into stage 2 sleep. We start to get these sort of sleep spindles and these K complexes. The K complexes, as you can see, are really part of what characterize the deeper wave stage 3 and 4. So they're a sign of this transition into 3 and 4. And then by stage 4, we're in this deep sort of slow wave activity. Then when we get into REM, or paradoxical sleep, you can see it looks a lot more like stage 1 sleep, and of course this is where we start getting rapid eye movements as well. So stages other than REM are really just referred to as non-REM sleep. When we fall asleep, we progress through stages 1, 2, 3, and 4 in sequential order. After about an hour, the person begins to cycle back through the stages from 4 to 3 to 2 and then into REM sleep. And the sequence repeats, with each cycle lasting approximately 90 minutes. So we cycle up and through these different stages of sleep throughout the night, which is why we're sometimes easier to wake than others. So stage 3 and 4 predominate early in the night. The length of these stages decreases as the night progresses. REM sleep predominates later in the night, and the length increases as the night progresses. And REM is strongly associated with dreaming, but people also report dreaming in other stages of sleep. What's important about this is we are most likely to remember a dream if we wake up during the time that we're having the dream or very soon after. Which is why when people report that they don't have dreams, they are dreaming, they just simply don't remember it. So this is a typical sequence of the sleep stages. Hey, we go to sleep here, we'll go through awake, through stages 1, 2, 3, and then stay in stage 4 for quite a bit. We go back up to 3, 2, and then we are in REM sleep for a while, then back down to 2 and 3 and 4, staying in 3 longer, but 4 not as long, and then as we progress through the night, in the shallower stages along with REM sleep. So stages 3 and 4, that deep sleep, tends to be more during the early parts of the night. So how does this all occur? Well, the first part of the brain we'll talk about is the reticular formation. There are various brain mechanisms associated with wakefulness and arousal. The reticular formation is a part of the midbrain that extends from the medulla to the forebrain and is responsible for arousal. The pontomesencephalon is a part of the midbrain that contributes to cortical arousal. Axons extend to the hypothalamus, thalamus, and basal forebrain, which release acetylcholine and glutamate. They produce excitatory effects to widespread areas of the cortex. Stimulation of the pontomesencephalon awakens sleeping individuals, increases alertness in those who are already awake. The locus coeruleus is a small structure in the pons whose axons release norepinephrine to arouse various parts of the cortex and to increase wakefulness. So this area is usually dormant while we're asleep. So this is what is generally associated with us waking up. The hypothalamus contains neuron that release histamine to produce widespread excitatory effects throughout the brain. This is the reason why antihistamines oftentimes produce sleepiness, depending on which histamines they affect. Newer antihistamines have gotten much better at narrowing the range of histamines that they affect, and as a result do not induce as much drowsiness. Orexin releases acetylcholine-releasing cells in the basal forebrain to stimulate neurons responsible for wakefulness and arousal. And the basal forebrain is an area just anterior and dorsal to the hypothalamus. GABA and acetylcholine are also important for inhibition in sleep. Cells of the basal forebrain release the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA. Inhibition provided by GABA is essential for sleep, and in fact, pretty much all sleep aids, with the exception of diphenhydramine, which is an antihistamine. Most sleep aids, certainly prescription sleep aids, all influence GABA. In fact, all of the benzodiazepines and drugs like Ambien all affect the neurotransmitter GABA. Other axons from the basal forebrain release acetylcholine, which is excitatory and increases arousal. Functions of this inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA are also important for decreasing our temperature and our metabolic rate, and simply decreasing the stimulation of neurons. And again, this is why those benzodiazepines are so effective at helping us sleep. Sleep can be localized within the brain. Sleepwalkers are oftentimes awake in one part of the brain and asleep in others. One phenomenon that occurs with drugs like Ambien is people will get up and do things and have no memory of it because they are kind of partially asleep, or they just simply have blocked memory for that event, so they're really mostly awake. We can also have what's called lucid dreaming, where we're dreaming but we're aware of being asleep and dreaming, and actually you can sometimes control your dreams in those cases. As I said earlier, sleep paralysis is something that happens to some individuals. The pons remains in REM while the other brain areas wake up, and this is what causes our inability to move because the pons is still asleep, whereas our consciousness is fully awake, which can be very terrifying. So here is a summary of the structure of the brain, the neurotransmitters, and their effects on behavior. So the pontomesencephalon releases acetylcholine and glutamate and increases cortical arousal as we wake. The locus coeruleus, norepinephrine, increases information storing during wakefulness and suppresses REM sleep. The basal forebrain has acetylcholine, excites the thalamus and cortex, increases learning, attention, and shifts sleep from non-REM to REM sleep. So this is particularly important for memory formation during REM sleep. Basal forebrain releases GABA, which inhibits the thalamus and the cortex, and of course is responsible for most of our sleep. Hypothalamus, parts of it release histamine, increases arousal. Other parts of the hypothalamus release orexin, which maintains our wakefulness, and the dorsal raphe and pons release serotonin, which can interrupt our REM sleep. So during REM sleep, activity increases in the pons and the limbic system. Activity decreases in the primary visual cortex, the motor cortex, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. REM sleep is also associated with a distinctive pattern of high-amplitude electrical potentials known as PGO waves. These are waves of neural activity that are detected first in the pons and then in the lateral geniculate of the hypothalamus and then the occipital cortex. This, we think, is probably associated with our dreaming because this is obviously an important part of the visual system, as we've talked earlier. REM deprivation results in a high density of PGO waves during uninterrupted sleep. What's happening is what we call REM rebound. So if you're deprived of REM sleep, either through overall sleep deprivation or because you have slept without REM sleep, and sometimes things like alcohol or certain drugs can inhibit dreaming, and as a result you will experience what's called REM rebound. If you ever laid down to go to sleep and instantly started dreaming, that's the phenomenon of REM rebound. So these PGO waves during REM sleep come again from the pons, the LGN, and the occipital cortex. Cells in the pons send messages to the spinal cord, which inhibits our motor neurons that controls the body's large muscles. This is why people with sleep paralysis, if they wake up, the pons hasn't woken up and hasn't released that control over the body's large muscles. So this prevents motor movements during REM sleep. REM is also regulated by serotonin and acetylcholine. Drugs that stimulate acetylcholine receptors quickly move people to REM, whereas serotonin interrupts REM sleep. And so people who have taken serotonergic drugs like methylene dioxymethamphetamine or ecstasy oftentimes have disrupted REM sleep and will go through REM rebound. There are a variety of sleep disorders. The most common of these is insomnia. This is a sleep disorder associated with inadequate sleep caused by a number of factors, including noise, stress, pain, diet, and medication. Obviously, diet depends on what a person has been eating, if it includes any caffeine. Stress is particularly problematic, particularly in our modern world. Insomnia can also be caused by disorders such as epilepsy, Parkinson's disease, depression, anxiety, or other conditions. Obviously, those often co-occur with stress, particularly depression and anxiety. Dependence on sleeping pills or alcohol and shifts in the circadian rhythms can also result in insomnia. People with alcoholics in particular have trouble sleeping without alcohol and also end up without REM sleep. Shifts in the circadian rhythms, such as time changes or shift changes, also can result in insomnia. So one of the things we talked about in the previous lecture is phase shifting or phase advancing or phase delaying. And here's what happens. So these are our sort of normal circadian rhythm and body temperature. So it rises throughout the day, then falls while we're asleep. So this is what we are our body's expecting, and this is where we are in terms of our time. So when we phase delay by traveling east, we end up having difficulty going to sleep. When we phase advance, by shifting the time backwards, now we have difficulty staying asleep. And so when you travel somewhere like Hawaii, oftentimes you wake up in the middle of the night because it's when you're supposed to wake up at home because you think it's a different time. Sleep apnea is a sleep disorder characterized by the inability to breathe while sleeping for a prolonged period of time. This can be particularly dangerous. Consequences are sleepiness during the day, impaired attention, depression, and sometimes heart problems. The causes include genetics, hormones, aging, obesity, and deterioration of the brain mechanisms that can control breathing. A variety of effects can occur. Increased cortisol levels and cognitive impairment may result. There are medical options to improve sleep apnea. This is a CPAP device. They come in smaller versions than this, which is fortunate for some people because obviously that's a difficult thing to try to sleep with. But essentially what it does is it maintains positive air pressure on the airway. Excessive snoring is associated or is a risk, certainly a risk factor for sleep apnea. Narcolepsy is a sleep disorder characterized by frequent periods of sleepiness and gradual or sudden attacks of sleepiness, occasionally what we call cataplexy, muscle weakness triggered by strong emotions, or sleep paralysis, an inability to move by falling asleep or waking up, and hypnagogic hallucinations, which are dreamlike experiences while awake. But generally the most marked symptom of narcolepsy is just suddenly falling asleep during the daytime. And so this can happen to all species. If you have time, look up a video called Rusty the Narcoleptic Dog, and you can actually see this happening. Seems to run in some families, although no gene has been identified. It's caused by lack of hypothalamic cells that produce and release orexin. The primary treatment is with stimulant drugs like Ritalin. There's a new drug called modafinil, which has been approved for treatment of narcolepsy, which is less stimulant than its cousins Ritalin and other amphetamines. Periodic limb movement disorder, the repeated involuntary movement of the legs and sometimes the arms while sleeping. This is sometimes called restless leg syndrome. The legs kick once every 20 to 30 seconds for periods of minutes to hours. And this usually occurs during non-REM sleep. REM behavior disorder is associated with vigorous movement during REM sleep, usually associated with acting out during dreams. Research suggests that inadequate GABA and other inhibitory neurotransmitters may be responsible. I imagine that this is something that I have because I wake up and it looks like I have been wrestling somebody in the bed during the night. Night terrors are experiences of intense anxiety from which a person awakens screaming in terror. This usually occurs in non-REM sleep. This is not necessarily associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, but can be. Sleepwalking is something that runs in families. It's actually called somnambulism. Mostly occurs in young children and occurs mostly in stage 3 or 4 sleep. Usually people aren't dreaming and it's perfectly fine to wake up somebody who's sleepwalking. In fact, it's probably preferable to having them walk down the stairs. So why do we sleep? Well, we've evolved mechanisms to force us to sleep. These inhibitory processes in our brains force us to become less aroused and less alert and thus to sleep. And this is an important part of our biological processes. Some of the many functions of sleep include resting muscles, decreasing metabolism, performing cellular maintenance in neurons, possibly removing toxins from the cerebrospinal fluid, reorganizing synapses, and strengthening memories. And in particular, this is the one I often focus on when talking with students because they so often sacrifice sleep for studying. And that is a huge mistake because we form long-term memories while we sleep, and the data is very clear. You are much better off going to sleep than continuing studying. In economics, we would call that diminishing returns from staying up all night studying. Sleeping is a much more effective way to consolidate those memories. The original function of sleep was probably to conserve energy, so this is accomplished by decreasing body temperature in mammals and decreasing muscle activity. So it's simply a time when we don't burn energy and are able to decrease our metabolism. That's what bears are doing when they hibernate during the winter. They simply lower their metabolism and their body temperature and essentially sleep that whole time away. Sleep also plays an important role in enhancing learning and strengthening memory, as I said a moment ago. Performance on newly learned tasks is often better the next day if adequate sleep is achieved during the night. Increased brain activity occurs in the area of the brain activated by a newly learned task while you're asleep. That's what's happening in the limbic system during REM sleep. In fact, we think one of the reasons why we dream is the brain's busy consolidating our memories, and we catch glimpses of that during this sort of semi-conscious state and try to make sense of it, which is why dreams always include things that are somewhat familiar, but then don't make any sense because they're events from several different time periods. And so that's why you get these kind of jumbled images. So patterns of activity in the hippocampus during learning were similar to those shown during sleep, and this suggests that the brain replays its daily experiences during sleep. The brain strengthens some synapses and weakens others during sleep. These sleep spindles increase in number after new learning, and this is correlated with nonverbal intelligence quotients. So these sleep spindles are associated with helping us learn new things. So we spend about 1/3 of our life asleep. About 1/5 is spent in REM sleep. Species vary in the amount of sleep time spent in REM sleep. It's most common in birds and mammals. The percentage of REM sleep is positively correlated with the total amount of sleep in most animals. Among humans, those who get the most sleep have the highest percentage of REM sleep. So research is inconclusive regarding the exact functions of REM, but during REM, the brain may be discarding useless connections. We may be learning motor skills and memories. One person suggests the function of REM is simply to shake the eyeballs back and forth to provide sufficient oxygen to the corneas. Not sure I buy that idea, but certainly we know that there's a lot going on during sleep, and the behavioral data is very clear. You learn more if you do sleep, and this is probably related to synaptic connections and probably even to pruning of neurons and generation of new neurons. So one of the things that happens over time is we actually need less sleep the older we get. And in fact, we get less REM sleep the older we get. So infants sleep the most. Teenagers probably sleep even more relative certainly to adults. We start to treat them as adults, but they certainly need far more sleep. Then as we start to get into our 40s, 50s, and then into our later years, we just simply need far less sleep, and we spend less time in REM sleep. So biological research on dreaming is complicated by the fact that subjects cannot often accurately remember what was being dreamed about. Two biological theories of dreaming include the activation synthesis hypothesis and the clinical anatomical hypothesis. The activation synthesis hypothesis is really related to activating and synthesizing memories. Well, that's our introduction to sleep and sleep stages. We will be talking more about sex and gender and the biological functions of hormones here in later lectures.